afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much. A few technical things to sort out there, but I think we're good to go. Good afternoon. My name's Linda Harvey-Ryu, and I'm the Indigenous Cultural Competency Coordinator for the Pragmatic Trials Training Program. Thank you for joining us today. This is the first of 4 sessions in our speaker series follow-up to the First Nations Principles of OCAP course. I'm so delighted to have everyone here. I know we were together during Sanios, the follow-up to that. And to start, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the Pragmatic Trials Training Program's coordinating team's offices, located in London, Ontario, are on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Arawandran. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors to our society. We also recognize that our work is carried out on the traditional territories of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples from coast to coast. We are thankful that we are able to work and collaborate on these lands. So I'm also very delighted that today we have joining us our knowledge keepers. And I would like to pass it over to them, to Helen, I think, first, and then Mary. If you guys would give it just a short introduction of yourselves and who you are. These are knowledge keepers who have been with us for the last year and a half, and we are now in our second year. And they're going to bless us with a smudge ceremony to start today. So, Helen, how about over to you?
Okay. Hautansianin Bonjour. Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Linda, for the introduction. So I just greeted you in my language, which is Anishinaabemowin, and Ininimuin, which is from my mother's side. And I have a smudge here this morning, or this now it's this afternoon, prepared. And just want to mention as well too, I'm dialing in from my traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. It's also Treaty 1 as well too that was signed with our First Nations here in this territory, which also includes some of our Innu, our Cree relatives. And just wanted to mention that I'm going to be smudging using this little frying pan here. It looks like a big frying pan on your end probably, but it's a little miniature frying pan. And it's also got some prairie sage that was harvested here in our traditional territory. And Mary also has one at her place there, but she's using an abalone shell. So when we smudge, I think some of you might recall when we had the follow-up from the OCAP sessions that when we smudge, we're clearing the air for the good work that our relative here today, Tibetha, is going to be sharing with us. And so with this smudge here, we are clearing the air for her presentation, and also for us to open our hearts and our minds as well too, so that when we're smudging, we take the smudge and we smudge our hands. And because that's where we do a lot of our work, a lot of our work we do is with our hands. So we're smudging our hands to prepare that work that we're going to be doing today. And we smudge our minds so that we are clearing our minds of any thoughts that we don't want to bring here, and clear our eyes as well too, so that we'll see all the good things that our sister is sharing with us today, that we'll see all the good work and the work that she needs some feedback on, that we'll be able to give that to her. We smudge our mouths so that we'll hear and see and talk good things. We smudge our ears so that we hear all those good things as well. And then we smudge our whole being. We smudge our hands, our body. Some people like to smudge their shoulders, their back. And even though you might not have the smoke there, you could do that on your end. And so we'll see miigwech this morning for this good medicine, for this good smoke that's rising to clear the air. And for that, we'll say miigwech. So we're ready to go for our sister here. So Mary, you want to introduce yourself?
Good morning. So my name is Ogamake Pematetnai Haskanawa, and that means grandmother to help people on their paths in all four directions. So it's a grandmother of four directions. And so my responsibility is to help all people. And I am akin to the wolf, and I am so pleased to be with you. And hello, and I send you blessings with the smudge.
Mm, Miigwech, Mary. I forgot to mention as well too I forgot to mention my name that I carry. My spirit name is Clam Woman, which is a little Miga shell, and also my family medicine is the Black Bear Clan, and I'm just very happy to be able to be here with you today. And with that, I'll say Miigwech and pass it back to Linda. Think you're on mute, Linda.
I was. Thank you. Thank you so much for doing that and blessing us all across the land here from coast to coast. It's my pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker. We're very fortunate to have one of our trial leaders in the Pragmatic Trials Training Program as our guest speaker today. Dr. Tibetha Kemble is a registered member of the Pi First Nation, which is Treaty Number 4. She currently serves as the director of the Indigenous Clinical Trials Unit, the Indigenous Project Lead for the Accelerated Clinical Trials Consortium in the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry, and she's an assistant lecturer in the Faculty of Education at the University of Alberta, where she's taught courses on Indigenous research methodologies, foundations in early childhood, and Indigenous peoples education. Her biography is much longer than that. I think I've highlighted it. And Tibetha, I'm going to turn it over to you. We're so happy to have you here today.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you, Helen and Mary, for the ceremony and starting us off in a good way and for sharing the teachings with us. I'm grateful to be in this space with you to share this space. And I recognize that I just wanted to also mention my presentation will talk a little bit about some of the um, I guess a brief history of some of the extractive research processes involving Inuit, First Nation, and Métis people and Indigenous women. So I just wanted to give you a heads up, just that there might be some disturbing content around that. So don't feel free, like you have to hang out if it's too bothersome. Um, but I'll start there. Okay, so let me get started here. Oh, I'm going to try this again. One second. Now, if I have presenter view on, which I have on right now, you should only see my big screen. Do you see the presenter notes as well?
No.
No?
No, just your major slide.
Okay, perfect. Oh, all right. So I'll begin just by acknowledging that I don't have any financial or non-financial conflicts of interest to declare for you today. But like Linda started us off, I also want to acknowledge the territory that we're gathered on today. And take a moment to ground us in place and relationship. So we are gathered on Indigenous lands, lands that have held laws and governance systems, kinship networks, and knowledge traditions since time immemorial. And these lands are not simply geographic spaces, they are living relationships. And for Indigenous peoples, those relationships come with responsibilities. They shape how we understand well-being, how we protect life, and how we make decisions about knowledge and research. And so when we talk about pragmatic trials or about data or governance, we're not doing this work in a neutral environment. We're doing it within Indigenous territories where Indigenous legal orders continue to exist even when they're not recognized by Western institutions. So these lands have their own laws, their own ways of determining what's ethical, what is safe, and what is best in the best interest of the community. So today, as we think through research, design, and implementation, and I invite us to remember that we are entering spaces with histories, stories, and obligations. So research is not simply an academic act, it's a relational one. It impacts families, nations, and generations. And acknowledging territory is not a formality, but a reminder that our work must honor the sovereignty and self-determination of the peoples whose lands and laws make this work possible. And my hope is that we carry this grounding with us throughout this session, that every framework that we discuss, every method we apply, and every decision we make reflects an understanding that research happens in relationship, and that relationship is governed by Indigenous rights and responsibilities. Okay. So I'll start in the way that I've been taught, in the way that I know how, by self-locating to you. And I like to begin sessions and presentations with a gentle invitation and a reminder that we are a story. The late Richard Wagamese once wrote that we are story. He said, all that we are is story. From the moment we are born to the time we continue on our spirit journey, we are involved in the creation of the story of our time here. It's what we arrive with, it's all we leave behind. We are not the things we accumulate. We are not the things we deem important. We are story, all of us. What comes to matter then is the creation of the best possible story we can while we're here. You, me, us together. And when we can do that, we take the time to share these stories with each other, we get bigger inside. We see each other. We recognize our kinship. We change the world one story at a time. And with that, I offer up a short little bit of my story, at least the one that I know now, to start out our time together in a good way. I'm a mother, sister, auntie, partner, friend, and relative to many. I'm also a registered member of the Pi Pot First Nation, which is located in the traditional territory of Treaty Number 4. And I was brought here to Amiskwichi, the place I'm proud to call home, through what is now known as the 60 Scoop, and raised alongside my brother, Braden, who was a member of the Saddle Lake Cree Nation. We had a rich and loving upbringing by our adoptive and late parents, Bryce and Patricia, who did their best to give us an interconnected and meaningful life that reflected our identities and cultures as First Nations people. As children of hippies, and my late adoptive father was born in the silent generation in the United States, and my late adoptive mother was born in the baby boom era, also in the United States. We were raised in a fairly unconventional household, one that gave us one that gave way to a deep and abiding curiosity about the world around us and how to live deeply in a deeply generous way that left no one behind. On a professional level, I'm unwavering in my belief that my path to the here and now is as it should be, meaning that the trajectory of my educational pathway, while a little messy sometimes, has unfolded as it should, with each step along the way revealing the next indicated step. As you may have read or learned about in other spaces, I left school early after the death of my adoptive mother and stayed in the workforce until my early 20s, when I decided to go back to school as an adult. I attended NAIT, where I obtained a diploma in accounting and then used that to bridge my way into an undergraduate degree in management at the University of Lethbridge, followed by a master's degree and then a PhD in educational policy studies in the Faculty of Education at the University of Alberta. Throughout it all, I maintained full-time work, raised a family, started my own business, and took on increasing responsibilities in educational leadership and higher ed. And in 2022, my world broke open following the death of my beloved father, and I stepped back and out of everything I'd come to know and rely on. And in 2023, I was approached by a dear colleague and friend who reached out to inquire if I would be interested in taking on some work in the area of Indigenous clinical trial research. And being the steadfastly curious person that I am, I took on the role that I now occupy, where I lead Indigenous clinical trials at the university. And this is where our story begins. So, for generations, clinical research has caused real harm to Indigenous peoples. And this includes direct harms like nutritional experiments on First Nations children in residential schools, coerced sterilization of Indigenous women, the disappearance and misuse of Inuit medical records during the TB sanatoria era, and the unauthorized use of biological samples from communities. But it also includes structural harms, being excluded from trials, being misrepresented in data, and having research conducted without consent or benefit to the communities involved. And these harms are not distant histories. Many of them happened in our parents' and our grandparents' lifetimes. And these shape how Indigenous peoples experience the healthcare system today and how we view research institutions. So when we see hesitancy or mistrust, it's not a barrier to overcome. It is evidence of a community's memory, and memory is a form of wisdom. That's why today's session cannot be merely about talking to you about how to include Indigenous peoples in pragmatic trials. Inclusion still keeps the original research structure intact, and that structure is built without us and often against us. Inclusion asks, how can we fit Indigenous peoples into the system? However, transformation asks a different question. It asks, how must the system change to uphold Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous governance, and Indigenous data rights? So the goal today is not recruitment strategies or token engagement. It's about reimagining what research looks like in Indigenous lands under Indigenous jurisdiction and in relationship with Indigenous laws, knowledges, and communities. And it's about moving from extractive practices to rights-based, relational, and accountable ones. Research that remembers its responsibilities can become research that heals. And that is the work we are here to explore together. So a legacy of harm, and I framed this as research that remembers, and then we'll move into research that respects, that looks at Indigenous rights-based framework for clinical trial research and pragmatic trial research. So for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with the rather dark history of clinical trial research here in Canada, in Canada, there were specific nutrition experiments conducted within residential schools between the 1940s and 50s, where Canadian federal researchers carried out nutrition experiments in isolated Indigenous communities and in at least 6 residential schools. Here, children and adults who were already malnourished were placed into treatment and control groups to test vitamin and supplement regimes. In many cases, increases in food or dental care were withheld from control groups. And so these experiments were conducted without proper informed consent and led to serious harm and long-lasting distrust of medical research in Indigenous communities. And if you have the interest in time, there's some phenomenal, really critical research by Dr. Ian Mosby, who looks at the physiological impacts of not only the nutritional experiments, but the experiment to withhold food and prolong starvation that has had profound, lasting physiological impacts on the rates of diabetes and fat accumulation amongst Indigenous peoples. Um, so the second example that I also wanted to share was around North America, so Canada and the US. From the early to mid 20th century and extending into the 1970s and beyond, Indigenous women in Canada and the US were subjected to sterilization, sometimes under the Sexual Sterilizations Act in provinces such as Alberta and BC, and sometimes via coercive practices in hospitals without free, informed consent. Government and hospital investigators have documented thousands of cases and continuing harms, and contemporary inquiries and court cases continue to surface instances of these practices into the 21st century. These reproductive violations are rooted in eugenic and racist policies and remain a major reason for mistrust of health systems, particularly amongst Indigenous women. And the third example is around biological sample misuse and genomic research violations amongst the Havasupai tribe in the US. And this describes a lawsuit against Arizona State University that exposed how DNA and blood samples collected for diabetes research in the 1990s were later used for other genetic research without tribal consent or permission. So what happened here was they obtained for consent from the community for a large research study, and then together as researchers decided that they wanted to use this collected biological samples for other research, but didn't go back to the community to ask permission or to gain community consent for use in follow-up studies. This case resulted in a settlement, as well as the return of samples and wide discussion about the limits of individual consent when samples have been collected, have collective cultural meaning. And amongst the Havasupai, there was particular concern around their inability to um, lay their dead to rest, and their traditions and their belief systems hold that the person has to be whole in order for them to be properly buried. And without their blood and other biological samples, they were unable to put their relatives to rest. And this remains a leading example of how modern genomic research can violate Indigenous values and governance when consent and data stewardship are insufficient. And then more globally, in Australia and Scandinavia and in other places, Unethical and medical and anthropological research on Indigenous peoples is not unique to North America. And in Australia, Indigenous peoples were subject to medical experiments, painful or non-consensual procedures, and data collection framed by scientific racism. And these legacies drove the development of the Aboriginal Human Research Ethics Committees. In other parts of Europe, or in parts of Europe, sorry, the Sami and other groups experienced racialized research and measurement. And these international examples show how common patterns, especially within research performed on marginalized peoples without consent, framed by racial hierarchies and justified by state or scientific institutions. So why do these matter for pragmatic and or clinical trials? Well, when we talk about the long history of unethical research involving Indigenous peoples, we're not recounting the past for the sake of sadness or guilt. We are naming history because it continues to shape the conditions in which trials occur today. And these histories live in memory and in community stories and in the ways people approach institutions and the ways institutions approach them in return. So, first of all, mistrust isn't a barrier, it's a rational response. And communities' hesitancy to participate in research is grounded in real documented harms. The nutrition and malnutrition experiments that I talked about in residential schools, coerced and forced sterilization on Indigenous women, and the taking and misuse of blood as well as other biological samples without consent, these are not abstract events. They occurred within living memory. So when communities question researchers or decline participation or show hesitancy or ask for stronger protections, they are practicing wisdom and not resistance. And this mistrust affects every aspect of trial research. Who chooses to participate, how long they stay in the study, whether they feel safe sharing information, and whether results are accepted as legitimate. Ethical legitimacy is not something researchers declare. It is something communities grant based on relationship, transparency, and respect. In the second instance, we need to remember that data is not neutral. For many Indigenous peoples, data, including genetic material, health information, and aggregated population data, carries cultural, political, and spiritual meaning. It can be tied to identity, to collective memory, to governance, and to the land. And Western regulatory models often treat data as a technical artifact, something that can be stored, transferred, and analyzed without consequence. But cases like the Havasupai tribe in the United States remind us that when data is used in ways that violate community expectations or cultural teachings, it becomes a site of harm and legal conflict and a rupture in trust that can last generations. So when we design trials today, we must understand that history is not behind us, it is all around us. It shapes how communities engage, how researchers are perceived, and what safeguards must be in place. Recognizing this is not about looking backwards, it's about building trials that honor, remember Indigenous sovereignty, protect future generations, and remember that responsibilities come with doing research on Indigenous lands. So how have policy and practice responded? There are some pathways forward, and when we talk about the legacy of research harm, it's equally important to recognize that Indigenous peoples and communities, as well as organizations, have pushed for and created new pathways forward. And these aren't simply policy changes. They represent shifts in power, shifts in governance, and shifts in how we understand responsibilities in research. And one of the most significant developments have been the rise of Indigenous-led data governance frameworks. In Canada, this includes OCAP, or Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession, which I heard you talk about. And this has been foundational in asserting First Nations jurisdiction over their own information. Internationally, the CARE principles extend this by emphasizing collective benefit, Indigenous authority, responsibility, and ethics as the core of data stewardship. And these rights-based frameworks remind us that data is not neutral. It is, again, relational, political, and often deeply tied to identity and cultural continuity. We're also seeing shifts in national research ethics. In Canada, here, we have Chapter 9 of the Tri-Council Policy Statement, which is seen as a major step in recognizing First Nations, Inuit, and Métis rights in research. But even more important has been the movement beyond compliance, where nations themselves establish research review boards, develop their own laws, and expect institutions to meet those standards. And more institutions are beginning to understand that ethics review is not simply procedural, it is jurisdictional. There are also practical shifts in how research is conducted. We're seeing more Indigenous governing councils built into trial design, more MOUs and data sharing agreements grounded in Indigenous laws, and more long-term partnerships instead of one-time project relationships. And we're seeing funders slowly begin to understand that time spent building trust, building governance structures, and building capacity is not overhead. It's the core of ethical research. I'm going to stop here with sort of my notes and just spend maybe 30 seconds talking a little bit about how this sort of shows up in the work that we do in Indigenous clinical trials. Some of the research partnership agreements, those documents that we sign with institutions, we've asked to have the data governance component added in and have been met with very little resistance, which is great. And then on sort of the national level around research ethics boards, here at the University of Alberta, we've agreed to take on a research review function for what's called First Nations Health Social Science Secretariat of Manitoba, who is a self-governing institution that doesn't have, I guess, what's considered a legitimate ethics body, but U of A sort of dovetails and walks alongside FINISM to enable research, the REB, to process their ethics application so that they can move forward to Health Canada and they can move forward into other sort of Western institutional spaces. But there are some interesting shifts happening, and I think there are some other shifts happening on TCPS Chapter 9 as well, which is really, really great. But these are all practical shifts in how research is conducted. So the pathway forward is not just about better policy, it's about better relationships and about centering Indigenous sovereignty in every stage of trial research, from the questions we ask to how we collect data, to who holds it, to how research results are returned and disseminated. And policy creates the container, but the practice and our actions create the relationship. And it's the relationship that ultimately determines whether research harms or heals. So even though we often talk about pragmatic trials or clinical trials as flexible, real world, and patient-centered, many of the structures underneath them still reproduce colonial assumptions. They may look neutral on paper, but in practice, they continue to disadvantage Indigenous peoples and other structurally excluded peoples and communities. One example is exclusion criteria, and these are often framed as purely methodological, intended to ensure internal validity. But they tend to exclude the very people who experience the greatest burden of illness, people with multi-morbidity, people with disabilities, people who don't speak English as a first language, people living in rural or remote communities. For Indigenous peoples, this means that the realities shaped by colonization, like chronic conditions, poverty, housing insecurity, or histories of medical harm, become the reasons for exclusion. In other words, colonial conditions become justification for not including Indigenous peoples in research intended to improve health systems. Another piece another place colonial structures show up is in institutional control. Universities, health authorities, and funders typically hold the authority to define research questions, who owns the data, as well as who interprets the result. Even when Indigenous communities are invited as partners, the ultimate power over design, governance, and dissemination often remains with institutions that were not created with Indigenous peoples in mind. And this perpetuates a system where Indigenous knowledge, legal orders, and governance structures are secondary rather than central. And finally, there's an assumption of neutrality. Trials often claim to be objective evaluations of real-world practice, but nothing about healthcare systems is neutral. These systems reflect colonial histories, policies, and inequities. And when trials treat the status quo as a neutral baseline, they actually reinforce the idea that Indigenous communities are deviations from the norm, when in reality, it's the system that is misaligned with Indigenous worldviews and rights. So the point here is not to criticize trials themselves, but to recognize that if we don't examine these underlying structures, we end up reproducing the same exclusions, the same inequities, and the same colonial patterns that have shaped research for generations. This awareness is the foundation for creating trials that truly honor Indigenous sovereignty and relational accountability. Now we're going to shift into research that respects and look at rights-based frameworks. To understand what I mean, what it means to conduct research that respects Indigenous sovereignty, we must start with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or what's called UNDRIP. UNDRIP is not simply an international document. It is a framework that affirms Indigenous peoples' inherent rights to self-determination, governance, culture, and data. It provides the rights-based foundation that should guide all research involving Indigenous peoples, including pragmatic and clinical trial research. There are 3 articles that are especially important for research. Article 18, which affirms the right of Indigenous peoples to participate in decision-making in matters that affect their rights through their own representative institution. In research, this means that communities must be involved not just as participants, but as decision makers at the design table, in governance structures, and in decisions about methodology, consent, and data use. Advisory committees alone are not enough. Article 10 tells us that sovereignty requires meaningful authority as opposed to symbolic involvement. Article 31 recognizes the rights of Indigenous peoples to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and critically, the manifestations of their sciences and technologies. This directly includes data, genetic materials, biological samples, and community knowledge systems. In pragmatic trials, Article 31 means that data governance must reflect Indigenous law and jurisdiction. It challenges the default assumptions that institutions own or control data collected in Indigenous communities. And Article 32 affirms the right of Indigenous peoples to determine priorities and strategies for the development and use of their lands, territories, and resources. Research conducted on Indigenous lands using Indigenous resources, including human biological material, is therefore subject to Indigenous governance. Pragmatic trials cannot be separated from the land and governance context in which they occur. When taken together, these articles remind us that Indigenous rights are not optional considerations in research, but rather they are foundational conditions. UNDRIP requires us to shift from an ethics-based approach, which focuses on doing no harm, to a rights-based approach, which focuses on upholding Indigenous jurisdiction, authority, and self-determination. In other words, UNDRIP tells us that research must not only be ethical, it must be lawful within Indigenous legal orders of the communities whose lands, knowledge, and bodies are involved. And then when we think about and talk about Indigenous data sovereignty in the context of pragmatic trials, one of the most practical and influential frameworks we can have in Canada is OCAP, ownership, control, access, and possession. And like you've probably learned, OCAP was developed by First Nations to assert jurisdiction over their data, and it remains one of the clearest expressions of what Indigenous sovereignty looks like in practice. And OCAP begins with ownership, the understanding that information about a community belongs to that community collectively, not to institutions, researchers, or data repositories. This is fundamentally different from Western research norms, where data is assumed to belong to the institution that collects and stores it. Control speaks to decision making, and under OCAP, First Nations must have authority how their data is collected, used, managed, linked, analyzed, and shared. It means that communities decide what questions matter, what methods are appropriate, and what uses of the data are acceptable, not the researcher or the ethics board alone. And access is about the community's right to view, use, and benefit from its own data. As you know, and as I know, too often Indigenous communities have had their data taken, analyzed, and archived without ever seeing the results. And OCAP makes it clear that communities have the right to access their information at any point without barriers. And possession, finally, is the P. It's often probably the most misunderstood. And I talk about this and teach this in Indigenous research methodology, but also in the other spaces with other Indigenous learners who understand what I mean when I say possession is different. And for us, possession is about physical stewardship. It reflects our reality that whoever physically holds the data ultimately holds the power. OCAP asserts that Indigenous peoples must determine where data lives, whether it's in community servers, in trusted Indigenous controlled repositories, or under agreements that reflect Indigenous law. Possession protects sovereignty by ensuring that institutions cannot unilaterally access, share, or reinterpret Indigenous data. So then the question I get often asked is, why must data remain under Indigenous jurisdiction? Because data is not neutral. It carries identity, culture, governance, and collective memory. For many Indigenous nations, data is a living extension of the community. When data leaves Indigenous hands, so does control over how the community is represented, understood, and acted upon. OCAP ensures that data serves the community's well-being as opposed to institutional interests. In pragmatic trials, this means we cannot treat data governance as a technical detail, but rather as a matter of rights, law, and relationship. And OCAP offers us a pathway, a practical rights-based guide for ensuring that research upholds Indigenous sovereignty at every stage. And alongside OCAP, another important framework for understanding Indigenous data sovereignty are the CARE principles: collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. These principles were created by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance to complement the FAIR data movement, which focuses on data being findable, accessible, interpretable, and reusable. But the CARE principles shift the focus from data efficiency to data justice and from technical to Indigenous rights. The first principle, collective benefit, reminds us that data should support the well-being of the community as opposed to academic interests and institutional priorities. In health research, this means asking who benefits, who is impacted, and does the trial create capacity, knowledge, or healing that endures within the community? Authority to control reinforces that Indigenous peoples have the right to govern the collection, access, use, and reuse of their data, consistent with their own laws, governance structures, and cultural values. It aligns with UNDRIP and OCAP and pushes researchers to recognize that Indigenous communities are not stakeholders. We are rights holders with legal authority. And responsibility is about the obligations that researchers, institutions, and funders have towards Indigenous communities. Responsibility asks us to move beyond compliance and into relationship. And we ensure that the data is, and are we ensuring that the data is contextualized respectfully? Are we preventing misuse? Are we honoring the cultural, social, and governance implications of the information we gather? And finally, ethics, the final principle, asks us to consider not just procedural ethics, but relational ethics. It reminds us that scientific benefit does not justify harm, that community protocols and cultural teachings matter, and that Indigenous moral and legal frameworks must guide research involving their data. Ethics in this context is not simply about avoiding wrongdoing, it's about doing research in a good way. Together, the CARE principles reframe how we think about data in pragmatic trials. They remind us that data is not merely a resource, but a relationship. They guide us towards research that produces community benefit, honors Indigenous authority, and embeds responsibility and cultural ethics into every stage of the work. In this way, CARE becomes not just a data framework, but a pathway to research that genuinely supports Indigenous sovereignty and wellness. One of the biggest shifts we need to make when talking about Indigenous research is moving from an ethics-based mindset to a rights-based one. And I get a lot of questions about what a rights-based approach means. And ethics tends to focus on protecting individuals from harm, whereas rights focus on recognizing Indigenous peoples as a collective, as self-determining nations with jurisdiction, authority, and legal orders that must be upheld. And when rights are present, institutions therefore carry responsibilities. They're not optional, they're not symbolic, they're obligations. And too often, research conversations stop at consent, but consent on its own is not sovereignty. Individual consent is only one part of what's needed. It doesn't address collective decision-making, community authority, data governance, or Indigenous law. And consent also doesn't fix the structural power imbalances. It simply invites Indigenous peoples into a system that has historically harmed them. Sovereignty, on the other hand, demands accountability. It requires institutions, universities, health authorities, funders, and ethics boards to adapt their processes to Indigenous governance and not the other way around. It asks researchers to respect community protocols, adhere to our oversight, and co-create governance agreements that ensure data remains under our jurisdiction. And rights require institutions to do more than consult. They require institutions to share power, to return data, and to honor our decisions, including the decision to say no, and to support long-term relationships rather than one-time projects. This requires, of course, transparency, as well as meaningful participation and a willingness to change institutional policies that conflict with Indigenous laws. And I'm sure there's probably some folks in the room saying, like, well, how do you do that? It is possible. We're starting to explore this trajectory within the University of Alberta in the work that we're doing with Indigenous clinical trials. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward. So when we say that rights demand responsibility, we're talking about a deeper transformation as opposed to merely checking the box. Not just securing signatures on consent forms, but aligning research practice with Indigenous sovereignty, with UNDRIP, with OCAP, and with CARE, and with the inherent rights of the peoples whose lands and knowledge make research possible. Consent opens the door. Responsibility determines how we walk through it together. And so when we talk about honoring Indigenous sovereignty in pragmatic trials, governance is one of the most powerful places that where this shows up. Governance is where authority lives. It's where decisions are made, where accountability is held, and where sovereignty becomes real in practice. But not all forms of engagement qualify as governance. Many research projects rely on advisory groups. And advisory groups can play an important role. They offer insight and guidance and community perspectives. But advisory groups are not governance. They do not hold decision-making power. They cannot veto a protocol that harms community, stop the data from being misused, or redirect the research if the trial is going the wrong direction. When Indigenous involvement is limited to advice, the institution still holds the authority. That is not sovereignty, that is consultation. And I'm just realizing here we're almost running out of time because how long do I have until? Quarter two?
I would say it'd be nice to have maybe 10 minutes at the very
Okay.
end. If you want to continue, it'd be nice to
All
have
right.
5 to 10 minutes. There's a big crowd here. I bet they've got a couple of questions.
Well, so I'll
Feel
do what I
free.
can. We're going to
No,
squeeze it
whatever
in.
works for you. Whatever works.
Okay. I want to make sure that we cover this, but there's some really important lessons that we've learned along the way from our grandmother's council, who spent an entire day talking through the difference between an advisory council and simply the grandmother's council. And they said, I can advise, we can be advised until the end of time, and I can choose to do nothing with it. And so the shift with the grandmother's council is really just honoring and respecting their authority. If they tell us what to do, it's our obligation and responsibility to do it. And so that's one of the shifts that we're seeing within the ACT portfolio area. And in my own area in Indigenous women's health research, I'm co-chair of the Indigenous Governance Council there too, where we share decision-making authority with the Women and Children's Health Research Institute at the University of Alberta as a whole. So it's shifting the dynamic in really important ways. And so we talk a little bit about, and what I'm referring to here is co-governance. And in a co-governance model, Indigenous nations, peoples, we share decision-making power. And this might include joint oversight committees, co-chairs, shared authority over data use, co-development of not only protocols, but also directions in research, priorities in research, as well as equal say in whether a trial or research proceeds. Co-governance acknowledges that both Indigenous and institutional laws and responsibilities must guide the research. It begins to shift the power dynamics that have historically shaped not only research, but clinical trial research and pragmatic trial research. And then at the other end of the continuum are Indigenous-led governance models. And in these models, Indigenous nations hold primary authority over the research. They guide questions, the methodology, data stewardship, and the knowledge mobilization. Institutional researchers in this kind of governance model join the work as partners, not as owners. And this is the model that most fully honors Indigenous sovereignty because it centers Indigenous jurisdiction over land, bodies, knowledge, and data. So the message here is simple but important. Advisory groups are not enough. If we truly want trials to uphold Indigenous sovereignty, we need to build governance structures that share or return power, not just ask for opinions. So whether it's through governance, co-governance, or Indigenous-led models, the goal is to ensure that Indigenous peoples are not on the margins of research decision-making, but at the center of it, guiding work in accordance with their laws and values, as well as collective rights. And then when we talk about shifting research from extractive to sovereignty affirming, we need more than good intentions. We need concrete tools that embed Indigenous laws as well as our authority and decision making directly into the structure of the trial. And these tools are not simply administrative paperwork, they are mechanisms through which sovereignty is enacted in research. And one of the most important foundational tools is a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, or what we're starting to see now. And if we take the thread that we started with around relational responsibilities, there are now what are called memorandum of relational understanding. um, which is not simply a partnership formality, at least within the Indigenous context. It is a relational agreement. And this helps to articulate a nation's authority. It articulates who makes decisions, how decisions are made, um, governance protocols, community processes that guide the research. And when an MOU is rooted in Indigenous laws and traditions, it becomes a living expression of jurisdiction, not just an institutional cooperation. There are other tools such as data governance agreements, and these are essential because, as we've discussed, data isn't neutral. In these agreements, it describes where the data lives, who can access it, how it can be used, and who can approve secondary use. These are all important matters of sovereignty. A strong data agreement makes it clear Indigenous peoples retain ownership, control, access, and possession of their information. So when we say tools, we're really talking about instruments of accountability and responsibility. MOUs, MORUs, data governance agreements, and the collective consent processes ensure that research is conducted under Indigenous jurisdiction, not merely with our advice. And these agreements root the trial in laws, values, and decision-making structures of the nation and the nations themselves. And that is the heart of sovereignty in practice. Collective consent. Oh, I've got 1 minute and I've got a few more slides, so we'll give it a go. When Western ethics boards think about consent, they focus almost entirely on the individual participant, the individual signature, the individual risk-benefit calculus. But for many Indigenous peoples, decisions about whether a research project should happen are not only individual, they're collective. And it's not a preference or a cultural gesture, it's an expression of community authority as well as our governance and our laws. So collective consent recognizes that research affects more than the person signing the form. It affects the land, the language, our knowledge systems, and our family systems, as well as future generations. When research involves Indigenous knowledge, territory, our biological materials, or data about the nation, the whole community has a stake in how that information is gathered, used, and stored. So the community, through its recognized governance structures, must have a say in whether the project proceeds. And this I can hear also, and I've had a lot of questions around the timing of this, because this, of course, takes time. To gather community consent takes an extended period of time, an ongoing reciprocal relationship. So this presentation will become yours after the fact, and I won't spend more time on this because there are two more slides that I want to share with you. Um, in our research, it means that we can't assume that obtaining individual consent is enough. Before anyone signs the form, the question must be, has the community said yes? Has the nation given permission? And under what conditions? Honoring both levels of consent is a part of respecting sovereignty and ensures that the trial proceeds in a way that is relationally and ethically sound. So I'm supporting two clinical trials at the moment. One working with an Indigenous community in Arviat that looks at upholding country foods and understanding its impact on community well-being and belonging. So unlike most clinical trials that rely primarily on institutional research ethics boards, the country food trials requires ethics approvals at multiple levels. So this happens at the Nunavut Research Institute as well as community leadership, but it also happens in relationship in the smaller circles that amongst participants that are looking to engage in our research. And this wasn't a procedural hurdle for us. It was a recognition that Inuit communities hold their own ethical frameworks, and their systems determined what was safe, what is culturally respectful, and what aligns with their community priorities. The REB at the university level was one part. Inuit approval was the core legitimacy of that trial and remains so. And we also looked at consent. It wasn't treated merely as a moment of like signing a paper, it was relationship. We followed the guidance from our cultural advisors on how to approach families, how to share information, how to ensure that participation was safe and non-coercive. We spent time in community. We are in community right now. We will be in community until the new year. And individual consent mattered, but it was inseparable from collective consent. So the community had already given permission for the trial to take place. And only then did individual participants decide for themselves. And as we were approaching the consent forms, these were translated into Inuktitut, and participants sat with a translator who walked through the consent form with them at every stage, answered questions about what this meant, what that meant, so that truly informed consent was obtained. And so another important part around this trial was around Inuit data ownership. The data, including the PHQ-9, any of the mental health well-being, the collective well-being data that this isn't neutral data. This is highly, highly um, respected data that we are gathering from the community. And so all of this data belongs to the Inuit community that we gathered it from, and they will determine that the ways in which we analyze the data and return it back to them, they will determine where that research gets disseminated to, how those research results are communicated. And so all of this, I'm giving you a very high level overview of this. All of this respects and affirms not only OCAP, the care principles, but the TCPS Chapter 9. And this, of course, the research that we're entering into with Two-Spirit Métis people was also a really important driver of improved care. And so in this one, we are looking at using AI-assisted OSCEs that are co-developed by Two-Spirit Métis people and under Métis governance and guidance. And so, oh, we're running out of time. I'm sorry. I wish I had a little bit more time with you. Maybe what I'll do, again, like this is yours. Both of these examples provide a clear roadmap for how we are shifting the relational, not only the relational dynamic between distinctions-based Indigenous peoples and communities, but how we are shifting the landscape of rights recognitions within institutions, as well as who owns the data, how consent is collected, how research results are communicated. And ultimately transforming the space of clinical trial research and pragmatic trial research for Indigenous peoples and communities. And so again, all of these are yours. You know about responsibility. I've talked a little bit about responsibility, reciprocity, repair, and I'll maybe end with just a closing line around relational accountability in that it transforms research from something that takes something that gives, sustains, and repairs. When responsibility, reciprocity, and repair guide not only pragmatic but clinical trial research, the research becomes part of the community's well-being, not a threat to it. And so that's what it means to do research that remembers its responsibilities. And there was a tool that I wish I could go over with you, but maybe we can have another session. And that is it from me. I'm sorry I didn't get enough time with you.
It's no, I'm sorry we had to just kind of, I just want to have a few minutes left, but I wanted to, it's a wealth of information, Tabitha. Thank you. Just a moment here. I turn my own camera on. Thank you so much. It was just an absolute wealth of information and certainly what we're all interested in learning and hearing about. I want you to thank you for including us in your story and making us part of your story today. It was very much appreciated. We don't have a lot of time, but we have a good 5 minutes. I'm going to ask Sierra how to get back to how we can do questions. And I'm sure that people might have a few questions. And if you do, it'd be great if you could turn your camera on, number one. Number two, if you could at least identify yourself and say who you are. And let's go ahead if we have a few minutes to go ahead. I'm looking at the chat too. So anybody have a question they would like to ask? And I'm sorry that we didn't have more time, but you've made me think already that maybe we need another time where we could just all come back for questions if that's possible. So I'm going to turn it over to the audience. Do you have anything that you would like to say? And I would suggest if you do, you can put it in the chat if you like, or if you would like to just turn your camera on and say hello and ask a question, please go ahead.
I'm just going to jump in here for a quick second. It was very, very well done. I appreciated listening and watching your presentation. It was excellent.
Thank you.
Such a lot of information. It's so wonderful to hear. No, it is, and I have to tell you that one of the reasons why I invited you is because it's so much information, and for a clinical trialist to try and wade through what is it about, what do you do, how do you do it?
Mhm.
You really have a handle on how it all works and what it's about. So it's so wonderful to have you explain that to us today to begin with.
You're welcome. And it's as our clinical trial research with Inuit and Métis Two-Spirit communities progresses, we will have, I think, more and more, I think, meaningful examples of like how this work is transforming the space, not only in clinical trials, but I think it'll help shift, pragmatic trial research in the future too. One of the things, and I'll just keep talking until somebody raises their hand. If not, that's okay. One of the things that we've struggled or pushed up against with in our own work is really around this idea that Indigenous ways of knowing and being and Western knowledge push up against each other as if they're in competition. And, with Western institutions saying like, our ways of doing this thing hold the greatest amount of validity and reliability, and we can do all of these things and test all of these things, and this is the answer. And so when we work with our Grandmothers Council, one of the really beautiful insights that we gained last time was, I was just sitting around the table, we were on a break, and one of the grandmothers just sort of lifted her head and she said, "You know what?" And I said, "What?" And she's like, "We are the original trialists." And I was like, "Yeah, you're right. All of our medicines have been time tested and are reliable and valid just on their own." And that made me think about just how do you extend that thinking into all of our work in clinical trials? Like we, our knowledge is valid. It doesn't have to exist in competition. We can coexist in this space in alignment with the 201, and we have the ability to share this space safely and respectfully. And so that's just one of the really beautiful ways in which they've helped to shape our understanding. Please, yes, Helen.
Yeah, thank you for that, Tabitha, because I really loved what you had to say about on your slide around Indigenous governance.
Mhm.
And when you look at the narrative, because a lot of times when you're asked to sit on advisory committees, oh, that's such a big honor. But you hit the nail on the head because you said, yeah, you could be advisory. It's the same when the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action came out. That really opened my eyes too, because calls to action makes that commitment to do the work. Because what was happening before is it was recommendations, right? And it's soft language. And so we have to change that narrative. And I
Absolutely.
loved what you said that about, I wrote it down here as well too, about honoring and respecting authority. And especially when you talked just now, just a few minutes ago, talked about your grandmother's council. I thought
Yeah.
that was just awesome because it should be. That's how it should be.
Mhm.
And that the grandmothers, myself, Mary, and others, that we were the original clinical trialists and all of the above. So thank you so much. I loved your presentation. It was totally awesome. Let me go ahead.
Oh,
Okay, awesome.
thank you.
So I see Pragmatic Trials has their hand up. I'm not sure who that is, so.
Yeah, it's me, Linda. It's Sierra. Thanks, Tibetha, for presenting. That was wonderful. Others can hop off, but I was wondering if you had a few extra minutes to stay on, maybe while we're recording, and you could go through that tool with us, just so we have it as part of the recording, and maybe it'd be helpful to share with others if they need to hop off now.
You bet. You bet. And yeah, the grandmothers were um have been so instrumental in helping to shape and shift us in really safe and caring ways, just in the gentle way that they. But when they said, like, when I tell you something, I'm not advising you. Like when I'm telling you something, I expect you to do it. And I was like, yeah. And so that helped to shape us into a space in our own work around like we're not advising you about how we think things. We are telling you this is how it's going to happen. And the rights-based framework emerged from that space, not in opposition, not in like we're going to fight our way, but just holding space,
Mhm.
um, authority to rest in both places. Okay, so let me get to the tool part here. And of
Mm.
course, I closed all of my windows, so now I have to go and figure it out. Okay, here we go. All right. You see that okay?
Yeah, looks
Okay.
great. Yeah,
Okay.
thanks.
So this is just something that we've developed over time. And I wanted to introduce it to you, and I'm sorry that we ran out of time, but this is what we are starting to think about around the rememberings tool. So this tool was designed with really a deliberate purpose to help shift us away from compliance thinking and towards relational accountability. So in Indigenous research, especially in clinical trials, the goal is not to meet requirements. The goal is to uphold relationships, responsibilities, and rights. And so the rememberings tool helps us to stay really grounded in that understanding. And you'll notice when I talk, I'm not talking about a language of check marks and like do this, do that. It or around metrics or around scoring, it uses questions. Am I in right relation? How do I still owe? How will I honor this responsibility? And these questions come from an Indigenous way of understanding knowledge and responsibility. And they remind us that research is a living practice, something that we return to again and again and again, rather than something that we complete and move on. So it moves out of the space of transaction to relationship. And so the rememberings tool is meant to serve as a relational guide, as opposed to a checklist. And I know maybe people are like, "Ooh, a tool! Ooh, I can download the tool." It's really an invocation to remember, and something that you can return to at different stages of the trial during design, implementation, during data analysis. And it's a way to ask ourselves whether we're moving with care, with accountability and with respect for Indigenous sovereignty, and helps us to keep and stay honest, not only with ourselves, but in relationship. And so when you use and think about a rememberings tool, we're not asking, did I follow the rules? We're asking, did I uphold the relationship? Did I honor the community's governance, their data, their priorities, and their rights? Did I create benefit or did I cause harm? Did I stay accountable all the way through? And these are, of course, as you can see, are not merely compliance questions. They are ethical and relational commitments, grounded in Indigenous laws and relational practice. So, as you move through your own training, as you move through your own pragmatic trial research, I invite you to think of this tool as a companion, a way of keeping yourself aligned with Indigenous values of responsibility, reciprocity, and respect. And through that lens, it's about relational accountability. And so these questions, the tool is really a reflective piece, a tool that people can use to reflect back in on their own practice as a relative in the space of research. And I think that's probably what makes it a bit more powerful than compliance-based. And that's it.
Beautiful. Thank you so much,
You're most
honestly.
welcome.
Tibetha, really an absolute pleasure to meet you finally after a year of knowing you're here and hoping to meet you. And I thought maybe I'd just cross your path at one place or another. I've visited many of the fa facilitated sessions, but it didn't happen. So it's an absolute joy and honor to meet you today. And I thank you so much for using the word story, your story, our story. I was going to call this whole session our story. And then I thought, no, I'm not going to do that. I thought it's just sort of a follow-up because we have different people, but it really is a continuing story that will go on, coming from the past and into the future. And also, I
Mhm.
want to thank you for talking about the grandmothers because we have two wonderful grandmothers who've been my guiding light for the last year and a half. And it was so nice to have them honored today too. So thanks very much. And thanks everybody for coming. It's
Thank you,
wonderful.
Mary, and thank you, Ellen, again for being here. I'm honored to have you in this space and to be in this space
Awesome.
with you. Thank you.
Our
Thanks so much.
pleasure. Take
Bye,
care.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Blessings.